incident resulted from a most regrettable combination: failure of a U.S. officer to follow clear and explicit MACV orders, secondly, a pilot error in identifying the target. It's occurred to us that since Cambodia initially mistakenly identified the aircraft as GVN, we could perhaps ask the GVN to accept responsibility for the incident. However, since it's so widely known that the VN Air Force was not operating in the area, and since General Key or some of his officers would object to being publicly charged with incidents for which they were not responsible, he doesn't see how we could do that. Dean Rusk feels it would be terrible to try to offload the responsibility on any other country. We could, of course, pretend it never happened.
Everything about Johnson was big. He was a tall man, a big man. He gestured expansively. He ate enormously, much too much. He had to constantly diet. He could drink like nobody else. I have never seen anybody who could drink so much and not be affected by it. I never saw him drunk. Oh, he'd maybe slur a word now and then, but Lyndon was always in total control. He was the man in motion, perpetually in motion. Without question, when you judge Lyndon Johnson, he was the most effective legislative leader of the period that I was around, 37 years or so. Probably the most effective legislative leader of the century. He had all the moves. He knew how to use power. He was ruthless. He was persuasive, mentally, physically, emotionally, and every other way. Overwhelming was the way I describe it.
Well, thank you for joining me for another LBJ tape series. This video has 3 components. One is a short conversation you see from the thumbnail concerning the U.S. mistakenly bombing a Cambodian village in April 1965 and National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy seeking President Johnson's guidance on whom to blame. 2. Research and data now show that Cambodia was bombed much more heavily by the U.S. than Laos and should be considered the most bombed country on earth. It's quite interesting. I'll just tell you a little bit about this. Finally, I will give you an update on Medal of Honor efforts for Phil Conran, whose heroics are featured in this video. Regarding the audio tape, Johnson's National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy brings this incident to President Johnson's attention as to whether the U.S. should take responsibility for the bombing, blame someone else, or just pretend it didn't happen. As straightforward as this conversation is, it is odd to me for 2 reasons. First, the morality of high-level leaders spending such effort concocting all sorts of excuses for this error and the mental contortions they are manifesting to manufacture some sort of explanation rather than just admitting it happened. And knowledgeable as these top officials were, their naivety in not having a clue as to how violent war escalations were soon going to become and the damage they would cause. You see, not long after this conversation, the U.S. will be carpet bombing Laos and Cambodia, making this minor incident not even worth a phone call. If you will bear with me, I want to address just for a moment some key points you should know about our bombing campaigns over Southeast Asia and that you might be curious about. While moral hand-wringers have lamented our indiscriminate bombing, and rightly so, frankly, no military panel, to my knowledge, ever did an operational review to see how we got so much bombing wrong. I find this inexcusable. It is an operations issue. Some sort of after-action review should have been conducted so that we could have improved our operations. My book, which is a free download, is full of U.S. testaments on fratricide and faulty air targeting operations during the war. Now, you may have wondered, where does this idea come from that people blather about that Laos was the most bombed country on earth? More tonnage than our bombing in World War II, some say. It comes from Cornell University's Air War Study Group study called The Air War in Indochina. Published in 1972, the data cutoff was 1971, and the study found that the U.S. had dropped 1.6 million tons of bombs over Laos more than double the 600,000 tons it had dropped over our enemy North Vietnam. Now 1.6 million tons is more than the 1.4 million tons dropped on Germany and more than the 0.8 million tons dropped on Japanese targets, but not more than we dropped on Europe combined or during the entire war. I travel to Laos often, and if you go a few miles without seeing a bomb crater, you're just not looking in the right place. You can't walk very far without coming upon a bomb crater. Here is a school I visited for charity work with 2 huge bomb craters on its front steps. Here is another school adorned with posters for kids concerning the hazards of UXOs. We teach our kids the ABC song. Lao kids sing the Bommy song to teach them not to pick up UXO. Now, I'm not a pilot, but with 21 years in the U.S. Army, half of it in airborne units, and tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, I know a bit about targeting. There are several reasons for the indiscriminate bombing during the Vietnam War. Here are a few of the primary ones. First, aircraft coming back to Thailand from sorties over North Vietnam, where weather had prevented bombing, had to jettison their bombs somewhere before landing at Royal Thai airfields. The U.S. Air Force had grid zones marked in Laos that were supposedly uninhabited by humans, and U.S. aircraft could drop the bombs in these zones, but they first had to contact the Air Operations Center in Vientiane for permission. An Air Commander U.S. Air Force officer, who happens to be a friend of mine, who had just reported to the Vientiane Air Operations Center, told me the story, which I have written about, of standing near a radio room in the Operations Center when a pilot radioed in requesting permission to drop his payload. No one was in the room, but a lowly airman walking by picked up the radio microphone and blindly provided permission. Author Max Hastings quotes a B-52 navigator as saying he felt that he and his crew had just bombed an endless succession of map coordinates that seemed to do nothing except put holes in the jungle floor. The State Department during the war appeared aghast at repeated U.S. Navy misfires in Laos and claimed many more mistakes occurred with the Navy than Air Force. There was an infamous incident where the Navy had bombed the same friendly Lao village twice, even after Ambassador Sullivan, not my favorite ambassador, complained the first time, and it was off limits for bombing. When the Navy leveled it after a third bombing, Sullivan wrote one of his famed cables, simply writing 2 words, Tecumseh weeps, I guess referring to the noted statue standing at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. Now, the Raven Forward air controllers in Laos, fortunately, were the most credible air attack capability we had during the war, and they were judicious in target selection and always had eyes on target before it was fired upon. There was no carpet bombing with their operations like you would find on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Regarding Laos, it now appears that the country takes second place to Cambodia as the most bombed country on earth. Yale University's Cambodian Genocide Program, with its Geographic Database, CGEO, has, through exacting documentation, determined that more ordnance was dropped on Cambodia than was previously believed. 2.7 million tons worth, dropped in 230,000 sorties on 113,000 sites. Just over 10% of this bombing was indiscriminate, with 3,500 of the sites listed as having unknown targets and another 8,200 sites having no target listed at all. The database also shows that the bombing began 4 years earlier than is widely believed, not under Nixon, but under President Johnson. These numbers are nearly 5 times greater than the generally accepted figure, and in more tonnage than the U.S. dropped in the entirety of World War II, and that includes bombs that struck Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 15,000 and 20,000 tons, respectively. Previously, it was estimated that between 50,000 and 150,000 Cambodian civilians were killed by the bombing. Given the five-fold increase in tonnage, it is almost certain those numbers are higher. This is the town of Chantrea in southern Cambodia, which was destroyed by 2,200 tons of U.S. ordnance. One survivor stated, "The people were angry with the U.S., and that is why so many of them joined the Khmer Communists," which is an assessment that's generally accepted these days, that the bombing did drive people to the Khmer Rouge. The Cambodian bombing campaign had two unintended side effects that ultimately combined to produce the very domino effect that the Vietnam War was supposed to prevent. First, the bombing forced the Vietnamese communists deeper and deeper into Cambodia, bringing them into greater contact with Khmer Rouge insurgents. Second, the bombs drove ordinary Cambodians into the arms of the Khmer Rouge, a group that seemed initially to have slim prospects of revolutionary success. Years after the war ended, journalist Bruce Palling asked Chit Do, a former Khmer Rouge officer, if his forces had used the bombing as anti-American propaganda. Chit replied, "Every time there had been bombing, they would take the people to see the craters, to see how big and deep the craters were, to see how the earth had been gorged out and scorched. The ordinary people sometimes literally pooped their pants when the big bombs and shells came. Their minds just froze and they would wander around mute for 3 or 4 days. Terrified and half crazy, the people were ready to believe what they were told. It was because of their dissatisfaction with the bombing that they kept on cooperating with the Khmer Rouge, joining up with the Khmer Rouge, sending their children to go off with them. Sometimes the bombs fell and hit little children, and their fathers would be all for the Khmer Rouge." The Nixon administration knew that the Khmer Rouge was winning over peasants. The CIA's Directorate of Operations, after investigations south of Phnom Penh, reported in May 1973 that the communists were using damage caused by B-52 strikes as the main theme of their propaganda. But the Nixon administration kept the air war secret for so long that debate over its impact had come far too late. And now the conversation you've been waiting for.
Yes.
McGeorge Bundy, 9-0.
I saw nearly all of it. Mora, we think, left while you were talking. He certainly was due at the airport, and the plane, I think, is gone now. I'm calling on another matter. Have you got a minute?
Yep. Let me cut this TV off.
One of our aircraft has dropped bombs on a Cambodian village. I don't know whether you've seen the reporting on that.
No.
It's been in some of the papers. Well, it did do 2 or 3 days ago, April 28, 2 days. And we now have a full report from Saigon saying that it did. The operational question is whether we admit it to the Cambodians who are now accusing us of it. And the department is, on the whole, inclined to think there's no real alternative, that the United States government can't very well, that it will come out, and that we can't get anyone else to take the responsibility. It's very irritating, and we would have to, if we do the normal thing in an international situation, we would regret the loss of life, injuries to individuals, and damage to property, and extend deepest sympathy to the families affected by losses, and express our preparation to discuss appropriate compensation. Obviously, we're also annoyed because they broke windows in our embassy on account of Newsweek. That's not the same thing as a loss of life. This is a flat violation of standing target rules. They gave a target that was nearer the border than we normally allow, and then the fellow bombed the wrong village, and it was in the wrong country. Apparently, the damage, according to our Army attaché in Phnom Penh, is 1 young man killed and 4 civilians wounded. There's a pilot error and an air operation acceptance of the target which violated specific instructions which Westmoreland had promulgated at my direction in the wake of a border incident last October. This violation, etc., describes the violation. Incident resulted from a most regrettable combination: failure of a U.S. officer to follow clear and explicit MACV orders, secondly, a pilot error in identifying the target. It's occurred to us that since Cambodia initially mistakenly identified the aircraft as GVN, we could perhaps ask the GVN to accept responsibility for the incident. However, since it's so widely known that the VN Air Force was not operating in the area, and since General Key or some of his officers would object to being publicly charged with incidents for which they were not responsible, he doesn't see how we could do that. Dean Rusk feels it would be terrible to try to offload the responsibility on any other country. We could, of course, pretend it never happened, but there's a real question as to whether, and this is really what Max would prefer to do. We see two other possibilities. We might promptly accept responsibility and offer compensation. Second, we might say nothing publicly and have the GVN comment that no VN Air Force aircraft were in the area. The question is whether we can hold this position in Saigon, Phnom Penh, and Washington. General Westmoreland has appointed a board of officers to investigate and fix responsibility of individuals directly and indirectly concerned. The board will complete its investigation and submit its recommendations to Westmoreland within the next 48 hours. Now, you might prefer to wait a day or two until that board has reported, but it will report, I suspect, what Max warns us of. The immediate question is whether you're clear enough in your mind to authorize us to seek appointment in Phnom Penh, or whether you'd prefer to wait.
That's where the board comes in.
If I were in your position, that's what I'd do.
Yep.
All right, sir.
Okay.
Military veteran supporters of Phil Conran continue to lobby for his Medal of Honor based upon his actions on a battlefield in Muang Pen, Laos in 1969. Conran was recommended for the medal during the war, but was denied as the war was secret. To my knowledge, the few medals of honor that came out of Lao actions were awarded long after the war had ended due to the secrecy of the war. Phil's actions are riveting and heroic. Even the making of this video was an interesting story. I came upon a rusting U.S. helicopter in Laos and tracked down the story of a vicious battle fought here and found and interviewed one of the pilots still alive, Phil Conran. Please watch the video and then copy the narrative constructed in my video description or write your own and send to your senator or representative. It is shambolic. Phil was denied just because the war was secret. Thank you so much for watching.